Hi, we're going to get started with our next event. Feel free to move up. You. So Keith O'Brien is, before I read his bio, a wonderful supporter of the Exeter Literary Festival and has been for many years. He is an award-winning journalist and a New York Times bestselling author of 4 books, including most recently Charlie Hustle, a Wall Street Journal top 10 book of 2024, and just out in paperback. He lives in Lee, New Hampshire with his wife, 2 kids, and 2 rescue dogs, although I have seen a new rescue dog on Instagram recently, so perhaps it is 3. He is going to be in conversation today with Dan Provost, a lifelong Exeter resident who teaches English at Exeter High School and is on the board of the local Little League and is my son's Little League coach. And put in his bio, last summer, Dan's 10U All-Star baseball team was 1-1 in games umpired by Keith O'Brien. So I think that confirms his neutrality. So Keith's going to read first, and then they're going to talk.
Thank you, Katie, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be back at the Exeter Litfest. Such a pleasure. So I'm going to read from a very specific part of the book. If you already have the book, I'll be reading from page 107. 2 things I loved about this narrative in general. And the first is, I do think that in the last 35 years of Pete Rose's life, we forgot who he really was and why we ever cared in the first place. And so one thing I wanted to do with this book was go back, all the way back, and tell that whole story, the rise and the fall. Put him back on that mountaintop where he once was, that he rightly earned, and then we will watch him fall. And so, a big part of that book was that rise, and that's one part that I'm going to read from here today. The other thing I loved about this narrative in general, and about baseball in general, is that it's the little things. It's the littlest things that send a player going in one direction or another, a game going in one direction or another. And I think there's a lot of parallels to life. It's the little things that send us going in one direction or another. And this particular passage, I think, captures that. It is July 14th, 1970. It is the All-Star game in Cincinnati, Ohio. 50 million people are tuning in that night on NBC. 50 million for an exhibition game mid-season. To give you a sense of how big that audience is, last fall, the World Series games between the Dodgers and the Yankees were drawing 15 million viewers. 50 million people tuning in. 55,000 people have sold out a brand new stadium in Cincinnati called Riverfront. And this game goes into extra innings. It's now the bottom of the 12th, 2 outs. Pete Rose is coming up. He has struggled all night, not a single hit in front of his home crowd, to the point that he turns to the catcher behind him at the plate, a young man named Ray Fosse, and jokingly asks Ray if maybe he could serve up a fastball for him to hit. Fosse and Rose have a brief relationship. They have just met the night before, having dinner together on the west side of Cincinnati. And just before this passage begins, of course, Pete Rose gets a hit with 2 outs. The man behind him, Billy Grabarkowitz for the Dodgers, gets a hit. Grabarkowitz will never be in another All-Star game again. And then the next batter is a player for the Chicago Cubs named Jim Hickman. Hickman thought there was more to life than baseball, and his statistics proved it. He had a lifetime batting average of just .236 entering the 1970 season. He would play in just 1 All-Star game in his career, this one, and he nearly missed it. Hickman had opted to fly in from Chicago that afternoon. The plane was delayed, beset by mechanical problems, and Hickman arrived so late that he couldn't even take batting practice. He was nervous under the lights at Riverfront and possibly better suited for his next job. Within a few years, Hickman would be growing soybeans in Tennessee. But when the Angels' Clyde Wright served up yet another fastball inside, Hickman swung. And off the bat, it was clear that the ball was going to fall for a hit in shallow center field. On second base, Pete Rose never saw it land. He did what he was supposed to do. He took off running. With 2 outs, he was moving on contact. He locked in on his third base coach, the Cubs manager Leo DeRocher. And by the time Pete reached third base, he could see that DeRocher wasn't just sending him home. The old manager was almost running there with him. DeRocher was leading Pete down the line, waving his arms and shouting, "You gotta go, you gotta go." Pete had to score. In the AL dugout, Earl Weaver thought it was all over. Pete was too fast and his jump was too good. There seemed to be no way for anyone to throw him out at home. But the baseball skimmed across the stadium's new artificial turf like a skipping rock on a quiet lake, smooth and fast and true. 3 perfect bounces into the waiting glove of Kansas City center fielder Amos Otis. And Otis didn't hesitate. He came up firing. Everyone in the stadium now realized that the play was going to be close. Pete's wife, Carolyn, Pete's parents, Fosse's young wife, Richard Nixon, Sam McDowell, and Pete himself. Pete stole a glance over his left shoulder just as Otis collected the ball and then turned back toward the plate. He was halfway between third and home now, running flat out, fully committed. The throw was coming, and Ray Fosse, Pete's dinner companion from the night before, was straddling the third base line a few feet in front of home. The young catcher, the next Johnny Bench, with millions of fans watching on TV, and his peers, the future Hall of Famers, counting on him to make the tag, wasn't about to get out of the way. He stood his ground, placing his 215-pound frame between Pete and the plate. If Pete slides feet first, he takes Fosse out at the legs and never makes it home. If he tries to go around him, hook sliding, he could be out. The throw could beat him. And if he slides head first, Pete's signature move, it's probably the worst possible outcome. Pete breaks a collarbone, maybe both collarbones. Still instinctively, Pete almost does it. 4 steps before the plate, he begins to lean into his head-first slide, chin going down, hands coming out. Then, seeing Fosse up close, he hesitates, thinks better of it, plants his right foot in the turf, changes course, and makes a different choice. The only choice left for Pete to make as he's bearing down on Fosse. He decides to lower his shoulder and barrel into Fosse, standing up. A human spear unleashed in the hot summer night. Both men fall to the ground and Fosse rolls over. But since Otis's throw never lands in Fosse's glove, the call is easy for the umpire to make. Pete is safe.
All right, so I'm actually coming in hot from baseball opening day down at Exeter High School. We had 500 baseball and softball players in the big gym, called them all out from 6U all the way up to 14U. And just before the 6Us came out, these are the littlest kids in our league, I said, listen, you're gonna go out there and we got 800 people in the crowd, and no matter what you do, you're just gonna run out there, they're gonna cheer for you. If you trip, if you stumble, they're gonna cheer for you no matter what. So we have the same expectations of this audience. If we trip or stumble, you are gonna cheer for us no matter what. In the spirit of opening day, as a native Cincinnatian, I think you probably know this, for years and years and years, the first pitch in Major League Baseball was always thrown out in Cincinnati. Literally around baseball, umpires would wait until they heard that the first pitch was thrown in Cincinnati. Talk a little bit about why baseball is so big in your home city, and specifically the relationship between Pete and the city.
Yeah, so, It is the home of the first professional baseball franchise. A team that has a similar name as our local team, the Boston Red Sox, because when that team briefly folded and moved to New England, it kept the name Red Stockings. And then the city immediately started another team called the Red Stockings. So, baseball is part of the fabric of Cincinnati in the same way I think it's part of the fabric of Boston and New England. But I think Pete's connection goes much deeper than that. Pete is born and raised on the west side of Cincinnati. The west side was and is a primarily white working class part of town. And I do think, the race mattered. Pete himself knew that over the course of his career, that his whiteness mattered to his appeal. So he's this local kid. And one thing that I was stunned about in going back and writing this book is that I do believe it's a miracle we ever knew his name. It's a miracle he ever escaped the West Side. I don't think he escapes the West Side in 2025. Yeah. I don't think his family would have had the wherewithal to do that. And I don't think baseball would have ever found him. He's never the best player on his youth baseball teams. He's never the best player on his high school baseball team. He graduates with nothing, no minor league option, no college option. And yet, sort of wills himself to be something. And I think that connected to an inferiority complex that, Cincinnati has about itself.
There were moments earlier in the book where I thought, if you tried to write this as fiction, people wouldn't believe it, right? And then a few pages later, Mickey Mantle, comes up with the nickname Charlie Hustle as an insult, and Pete turns that into a compliment. And I think it's things like that, moments like that, where you can see him almost taking charge of his story, writing his own story. Did you find those qualities in him?
Yeah, so I love the story of how he got his nickname.
Yeah, tell that.
I felt it was important to go deep on every moment of significance in his life, good or bad. And I do think the day that he got his nickname is a critical turning point for his career. Mm-hmm. He gets that nickname. I know the exact date. It's March 17th, 1963. He is a minor league player at that point. He is struggling to make the big league roster of the Cincinnati Reds in March of 1963. And by rights that spring, he shouldn't have. Right. He enters that spring training just objectively fourth on the depth chart at second base. He should not be getting that spot. In fact, the reporters believe that Rose is going to be assigned to AAA San Diego. But something happens that March that happens to Pete a lot, especially in the early arc of his career. People sort of choose Pete because of something they like about themselves. And Fred Hutchinson, the manager of the Cincinnati Reds, is one of the first people to do that. Fred is a former major leaguer. He's a pitcher. He had never succeeded on pure talent. He had succeeded on grit and toughness and, frankly, a really hair-trigger temper. Mm-hmm. And here's this kid, rookie Pete Rose, sprinting down to first base and sliding into bases. He loves it. And so he starts playing Rose at second base more and more and more. And that Sunday, March 17th, the New York Yankees come to Tampa to play the Reds at Al Lopez Field. And it's a huge deal. Massive crowd, sold out, televised back in Ohio. A spring training game in '63 never happened. And Rose plays that day with that same sort of tenacity and toughness, sliding around, throwing his body around. It's sort of insane, actually. And Mantle and Whitey Ford, two future Hall of Famers, who are the opposite of Pete, who have been touched by the hand of God with greatness, are standing on the dugout at some point and making fun of him. Right. And I scoured the newspapers in my reporting, trying to figure out what did they call him. And I'm here to tell you, we're never gonna know. In the days that followed this game, some reporters said that they called him Henry Hustle. And other reporters said that they called him the Charlie Hustler. And it was frankly only a couple weeks later that the press settled on a story that the press liked. And they said that they called him Charlie Hustle. But to your point, Dan, it wasn't a compliment.
Right.
They were laughing at him because he was playing too hard in a practice game.
Right.
And when Rose makes the Reds that year, because he will, and he goes to cities he never thought he'd visit before, San Francisco and Chicago and New York, and he's meeting National League beat writers for the first time. He is more than happy to tell all the writers the story of the day that Mickey Mantle called him Charlie Hustle because he liked the way that I played. He spins it in his own favor. And I think, frankly, Pete Rose did that for the rest of his career.
Well, and I think you see it with the section that you read with Ray Fosse. That story, well, first of all, if you show that video to a kid playing baseball today, they're like, you were allowed to do that? I mean, he barrels into him like a middle linebacker and ends Fosse's career functionally, right? That's a story that people tell different ways. There was the manager who said it was a hard play. Fosse, I think at the time, talks about it one way, years later talks about it, and there's that sort of motif throughout the book of people telling Pete Rose stories different ways, depending on the era that you're talking about. There's like so many different iterations of him and those tales.
Yeah, I feel like in 2025, and we're both coaches,
Yep.
In 2025, it feels like that play is held up as an example of Pete's insanity,
right.
Like it's a character flaw that he did that.
Right.
But one thing that was fascinating about, doing the research was going through the newspapers after key games. And the beautiful part about going through the newspapers, say after the 1970 All-Star game, is that there were like 50 different beat writers there that night. So 50 different takes on the same, play, the same event, 50 different stories that include different interviews, different quotes, different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And what I can tell you is the next day, most people thought that what Rose did was right.
Yeah.
All the Hall of Fame managers that were on the field that night, including a future manager named Joe Torre, who was Rose's catcher with the Cardinals player and on the National League team that night, believed that Rose had done the right thing. Mm-hmm. There were a handful of people who didn't. One of those was a future Hall of Famer, Frank Robinson. Frank Robinson was in the American League clubhouse. In the minutes after that play, Ray Fosse's coming in. He can barely get his jersey off because his left shoulder is injured. He's going to go have it x-rayed right then. Yeah. And Frank says to him, could have he gotten around you? And Ray said, yeah, I think he could have. And that was enough for Robbie. He thought that was wrong, that he shouldn't have done that. But it wasn't as clear as it would be today, And I think, so much has changed in sports, if somebody did that kind of play today, it would launch, endless 24-hour coverage, and back then they thought that was tough, hard baseball playing, and everybody moved on.
So I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but I can't help myself because there's sort of an ironic parallel there in terms of looking at that play and how it would be viewed today. And now if we look at gambling today, and you watch ESPN and you get the betting lines for virtually every game. You get whole commentaries on how people should bet. It's sponsored by DraftKings. We have, the biggest superstar in baseball is involved with a gambling issue last season. And so here, the way that we look at it today versus the way it was looked at when Pete was being investigated are so starkly different.
I mean, who could have imagined, right? The whole world has changed. And I gotta tell you, we don't know where this is going.
Right.
We don't know. I have two boys. 15 and 17 years old. They are the first generation of children who are growing up in America with legalized sports gambling plastered on every commercial and every outfield wall in America. And I mention boys in particular because the medical science on gambling addiction is voluminous and goes back decades and is very clear on a few points. The greater access you have to gambling, the higher the rates of addiction. There is a baseline rate of addiction that exists for gambling in every population, regardless of access or not. But when you have access and you have this baseline addiction, there is one cohort that time and time again in medical studies struggles the most, and that's young men. And, you know, why did we see so many scandals last year, in addition to the one involving Shohei's interpreter around gambling? There were many others. Why did we see it? Because there's access, because there's free time, because there's money, and because the addiction happens when those things happen. And, you know, let's be honest. It's not apples to apples here, right? The fact that we now have legalized sports gambling doesn't mean that it's right that Pete Rose did what he did. It's still wrong. It still endangers the game. But it is wildly inconsistent. It is hard to separate the two. And, you know, I can tell you for a fact, because I talked to him about it, Pete Rose found it, you know, very contradictory.
Sure, and I mean, you have, like, as you say, you have access, you have free time, you have money, and you have a baseline addiction, and all of those things coalesce for Pete pretty early on in his professional career, where he's getting this big contract, he has the free time, the natural free time of the baseball season, and he has seemingly tremendous access as a native son of a city and some of the connections that he forms.
Yeah, and you know, so just to pull back for a second, so I did get access to Pete for this book. You know, I did 27 hours of recorded interviews with Pete on the phone at times and in person at times. Spent a couple days with him, you know, on the road when he was doing signing shows or when he was there as a keynote figure. So I had access until I didn't. You know, in the course of the writing of this book, Pete did stop calling me back. I don't know why. I can only speculate. My speculation is, you know, I didn't get to Pete through the front door. I didn't call his agent to get access to him. I didn't call his lawyers. I started doing reporting in my hometown of Cincinnati. I started doing interviews back in my town with the people who everybody in Cincinnati knows are Pete's guys, his pals, his guys he'd still go to the racetrack with in the final years of his life. And I just started doing interviews with them. And, you know, I got in the door with them, frankly, his friends, because I was able to say in voice messages or in emails, you know, this is Keith O'Brien. Here's some bona fides about me. I could tell them I was a New York Times bestselling author, but frankly, the thing that I think mattered more to them was that I graduated from St. Xavier High School on the west side of Cincinnati in 1991. Right. And I could put that in the opening line of the email. Yeah. And so I got in with them. I get an introduction to Pete through them. And I think that when his agent learned what I was doing and that I'd been there for weeks, essentially, I think he was troubled by that. And, you know, I was pushing Pete. And, you know, Pete only twice in his life, ever even came close to admitting he was addicted to gambling. The first time was in 1990 when he was in federal court for tax evasion, facing sentencing for that crime, and he, you know, told the judge that he had a problem. The second time was in 2004 when he wrote a very self-serving memoir in which he finally reversed 15 years of lies about whether he did or didn't bet on baseball. That's the only two times he ever talked even tangentially about being addicted.
Sure.
Without question, based on my reporting with the people who were there, the people who were with him, his pals, the guys he was at the racetracks with, 3 different guys who placed his bets on baseball, he was absolutely addicted to gambling. He could not stop. And I do think that goes back to his childhood on the West Side. You know, gambling was part of the culture there. The bar down the street from his house, men gambled upstairs. His father loved taking young Pete to the racetrack, the horse track in Cincinnati. I found it notable that when I asked Pete about, you know, what's his fondest memory from his childhood, he didn't talk about playing baseball or football or some moment of glory on a diamond. He said it was going to the racetrack with his father on the weekends. Yeah. And so I think it was hardwired in him. And I do think, you know, he was addicted.
And so when you talk about the connections that you formed and the interviews that you were able to conduct and the access that you had, and then layer on top of that the hundreds, if not thousands, of newspaper interviews and game stories and game reports. Then, of course, you have the Dowd report, hundreds of pages there. Just the research of this blows me away. But it doesn't read like it reads like a novel. It does not read like that type of research book. And so my question is, how do you take all of that and assemble a plot? Because there's a plot. I mean, you could read this as a novel.
Thank you. I mean, you do not want to see my home office when I'm working on a book.
Yeah,
that is what I can tell you for sure.
Good.
My wife doesn't even ask me to clean up when I'm actually writing a book. It's impossible. You've got stuff all over the floor. My desktop on my computer is insane. And you mentioned like the interviews and the newspaper articles, and certainly the Dowd report, obviously penned by John Dowd, a New Englander who lives still today down on the Cape. All of those things are crucial. One thing, though, that was more revealing than all of that was the federal court records that nobody had ever bothered to track down before. So when Rose goes down in 1989 and finds himself in the crosshairs of Major League Baseball for betting on his games, it's not because of something that happened that year or 3 weeks earlier. It really goes back like 3 years. Rose is hanging out with this group of guys. They're having good nights at the track. They're hanging out, going to parties. They're rolling around town. Some of these guys, though, are into other things. They're dealing cocaine. They're dealing steroids. They're using steroids. And they pop up on the radar of the FBI in Cincinnati. And so one by one, the FBI is starting to pick these guys off. Starts sort of on the fringes of his inner circle, and it starts to get closer and closer. And so, I went to find the federal case files of about 12 different people. And, you have to keep federal case files forever, but they're not in the courthouse. You have to figure out where they are. You have to order them back from a federal repository. It takes weeks. Sometimes they can't even find them. You pay, $60, $70 a box to have them shipped back. You don't even know what's inside them. They could be chock full, or it could be one file. Nobody knows. And I did all that work. And I find these records, and I have them shipped back to Columbus, Ohio. And they call me and say, your boxes are in. And I walk in, for a week, essentially, of scanning files in Columbus, Ohio. And, I've got my laptop, I got my phone to scan. I walk into the clerk's office, they take me to a side room, and there's like 12, 14 boxes there. And I just open them all first. What is even in here, And I'm talking about tens of thousands of pages of documents. And, I spent about an hour sort of getting a grip of what's there. And then I just started scanning, a full week of scanning documents in the clerk's office. And it was in that clerk's office that I thought, okay, I have this. I fundamentally have the unraveling of Pete Rose in a way that nobody's ever had it before. But, you know, writing that and putting that on the page is a totally different thing. And it's trial and error. It's writing and rewriting. It's being willing to totally scrap a chapter that you've written and starting over. And I think at the end of the day, though, from a real process standpoint, it's about knowing your story. When you've done all this kind of research, it's very easy to get distracted by shiny objects over here and go down rabbit holes over here, because there are lots of interesting stories within your story. You could write an entire book on Ray Fosse, say, right? And he's like just a character within a couple chapters of my book, right? So if you know your story, though, and you're able to tell yourself, or speak it out loud what your story is in 2 lines or less, I think, then you won't get distracted by those things. You'll stay on track. And so for me, you know, this is, at the end of the day, this was a book about the rise and fall of a great American icon, full stop. And if it wasn't about that, then it gets cut or pared down or stays out entirely. You know, it's just about that.
So the rise and fall of a great American icon, and then I can't help but think that also the fact that he was a baseball player and there's something about baseball has something to do with it. And what I mean is, if he had got noticed for his exploits on the football field, because he was a star football player, or he's a scrappy football player coming up, if Pete Rose becomes a football player, is this quite the tragic tale that it is, or is there something about baseball?
It's a great question. Such a basebal question from a baseball coach.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so
you could just say yes and we can go to the next one.
I mean, for starters, it is not the same. I mean, in the 70s, there were star football players, Paul Hornung being one of them, who were caught gambling. And they were suspended for a year, and they were back in the game. It was essentially slap on the wrist, and here you go. Some of these guys who were caught gambling would later become major sportscasters, football players. Nobody cared. There is, I think, or was a purity to baseball that we ascribed to it. The purity was never there, but we ascribed a certain purity to baseball. And so they were held to different standards. And so it fundamentally was different because it was a baseball story. And I think not only was it a baseball story and a great story of a baseball player, I think it was that story at the time when baseball was at its peak as a cultural touchstone. You know, I still watch baseball, I coach baseball, I love baseball, but as I said in my opening remarks, you know, last year Major League Baseball was hoping for 15 million viewers for the World Series, whereas Game 6 and Game 7 of the 1975 World Series right down the road here at Fenway Park drew 72 and 75 million viewers. I mean, that is just how much baseball has changed as a cultural touchstone.
And there are certainly other things that were coalescing. You alluded to this around that time, and notably race is one of them. Pete maybe said or maybe didn't say that he was one of the 2 most exciting white players, all right? And that quote appeared, and he said, I didn't say that, but people believed it would be something that he would have said. And it, quite frankly, might have been true that he was one of the 1 or 2 most exciting white players at a time when, in 1968, I think it was when he said that, the All-Star team that year had dozens of players of color, and there were far fewer white players on his squad. And his whiteness was a factor, maybe in that moment, as that insider-outsider tension was developing.
Yeah, and I think this is another parallel, I think, to the times we're living in today and the feelings that some people have. You know, we think about Jackie Robinson, and we think, oh, well, you know, Jackie Robinson came in and then everything changed. I mean, it did, but it didn't. Sure. You know, when Rose comes up in '63 with the Reds, a lot of teams still just have 1 or 2 players of color on the team. The American League especially so. it's really the decade of the 60s where all that changes. And so by the end of that decade, 68, 69, 70, all-star teams that had been, just a few years earlier, almost entirely white, are now almost the opposite. And this whole generation of Latino players and Dominican players and black players have come in, and they are huge stars and great talents, and they've taken these spots. And certain, in certain corners of America, that was upsetting. That was a sign of trouble. This was worrisome. And here was Pete Rose, the ultimate sort of white character. And he was, for being as uneducated as he was, and he would have used the same term. He was not a great student, even at Western Hills High School on the west side of Cincinnati. Despite all that, he was incredibly savvy, and knew, how to exploit situations for his personal gain. And I don't say that pejoratively. He was very good at publicizing himself. And in this moment of this rapid change, relatively rapid change in baseball, here's Pete Rose, and he does say, I deserve to be paid $100,000 a year, which was a huge salary at that point in baseball, the biggest you could have, because I'm one of the two most, popular white players in baseball, Carl Yastrzemski being the other.
Sure. So how did that land in his own clubhouse, a diverse clubhouse? How was that received around the league by other players and by fans?
Pete was able to say things that other people just couldn't say. Yeah. He got away with it with the press, who loved him. He got away with it with his own teammates, who, by and large, loved him. And, interestingly, even though Pete would say things like, I'm one of the two most popular white players, and would had no grasp in the late 60s or early 70s of the sensitivities around race and the vocabulary to use when talking about such things. Sure. Even though he lacked all of that, he was actually very popular among his black teammates. And I do think it goes back to something that happens in 1963. When Rose makes that team that year, he's this cocksure, arrogant, swaggering player who has jumped the line and jumped in front of three other guys that were very popular. And his teammates, even the white guys, don't like him. He's this big shot walking around the clubhouse. They don't like him. And so who befriends him on this team? Well, the other outcasts do. Frank Robinson, future Hall of Famer, then with the Reds, black player. Vada Pinson, another player of color, befriend Pete Rose. And take him out to dinner on the road when he's got nobody else to go to dinner with. And Rose remembers this, actually. He knows that they helped him. And so when young kids come into the clubhouse later, after he's a huge star, he'll do the same thing for them regardless of their color. And, one of those players is a player that you all will remember. It was George Foster. George Foster joins the Reds around 1973. He's a substitute. He's platooning in the outfield. He's not a big power hitter at that time. And, Rose befriends him, even though they were totally different. Foster is this, he holds Bible study classes in the locker room. Right. Rose is gambling in the locker room. And there's a moment that I found in a Cincinnati Post article around 1973 when the Reds are struggling. They've started the season. They're supposed to be good, and they're not. And there's several games back already in the standings. And after a day game, Rose tells Sparky Anderson, I want to go take batting practice right now, out on this field at Riverfront Stadium. And Sparky knows he can't tell him no. He just simply can't. So the groundskeepers, everybody has to wait while Rose does BP for like an hour. And, the pitching coach is pitching to him until his arm falls off. And George Foster has nothing to do. He's alone in Cincinnati. He's essentially a rookie there. And he goes and he shags balls in the outfield, puts them in buckets so Rose can keep hitting. And when it's over, Rose says to George, "You want to hit?" And George says, "Sure." And so Rose then throws BP to Foster. And there's this whole column about it that I find, I'm like, oh my God, I love this. And I'm trying to get to Foster, and I'm trying to get to Foster, and trying to get in through the front door or the back door. I'm sending him pass books, I'm sending him letters, I'm doing anything I can get. One day George Foster calls me. And we do the interview, like 2 hours on the phone. And I, get into the interview. I finally ask him, "Do you remember this day in '73? I think there's no way, right? There's no way. Sure. I mean, it's 50 years ago. It's a million baseball games ago. No way." And Foster goes, "Oh, I 100% remember that day." And I said, "Well, how can you remember that day?" And he said, "I'll tell you why I remember that day. Because no white player, no white star player had ever treated me the way that Rose did that day." And it was stunning. I could have never believed that he would answer the question that way.
And there are so many moments in the book like that, and these little glimmering sort of secondary characters. Foster's one, Fosse's one, his wife Caroline. Who were your sort of just favorite secondary characters in working on the book?
Wow, that's a great question. I mean, this is like a dream book to write, right? I mean, I'm trying to get to, just think about the struggle I just described. I'm trying to get to George Foster. I mean, this is a dream to try to do.
It's a good problem
right?
to have.
It's a good problem to have. But you're right. Like, some of the best interviews or the most stunning stories were not with the star player. It wasn't with the Hall of Famer. It was with some guy, down the roster further. I could say so many, but I'll say one here that I do think about on a regular basis, and it's Bernie Carbo. Bernie Carbo, formerly of the Cincinnati Reds in the early 1970s, then gets cut there, gets traded, drifts around, ends up with the Red Sox, of course, in '75. And for real baseball fans in the room, you'll remember that were it not for Bernie Carbo, Carlton Fisk doesn't have that moment in the bottom of the 12th in Game 6 of the 1975 World Series, because it's Carbo who ties the game in the bottom of the 8th when he's wildly overmatched in the moment, hits one of the most unlikely home runs in World Series history, and then immediately disappears, thanks in part to his own addiction issues. And so I'm trying to talk to as many players as I could who were on the field during the '75 World Series, because this is a crucial moment for Pete Rose, and Carbo was one of them. He calls me, I do multiple interviews with Bernie. And, we get to the end of the interview, and Bernie's like, the interview's over. And he's like, I just love Pete Rose, man. I just love him. He's the greatest. He's the greatest. He just starts talking like that. And I was, why do you love him? He's like, well, later in the 90s, he had his addiction problems, he goes into rehab. He almost dies. And Carbo gets out. He's clean. He's sober. And he's down in Florida. And he's got nothing. And he goes down in Florida, these spring training fantasy camps, right, that they still have today.
Sure.
And he's got a sack full of old baseballs, Carbo says. They're all old and busted and dirty. And he's trying to get some of his former teammates and guys he knew to sign him, and he's going to sell them. He's going to sell them to try to get back on his feet, just try to live. Yeah. And, some guys won't sign Carbo's balls. Because who the hell is Bernie Carbo in 1991, right? And some of those people are rather famous. You would know them. He comes to Rose, and he's got this sack full of baseballs. And Rose at the time lived in Boca Raton. He had a restaurant there. He's gotten out of prison. He's got a radio show he does out of the restaurant. He too is trying to get back on his feet. And Carbo finds him at the restaurant, and Rose sends like an assistant to the back of the restaurant, and he comes out with 24 clean baseballs, or as they would say in a major league clubhouse, he comes out with 24 pearls. And Rose signs the pearls for Carbo. And Carbo, at this point, feels terrible. He's like, I got to tell Pete I'm going to sell these. And so he tells him, I just want you to know, like, I'm going to sell these. And Rose is like, that's cool, man, whatever you need to do. Yeah. And so Bernie Carbo's like, Pete Rose saved me.
It's awesome. That's a great story. And there's sort of like, all right, this is maybe a stretch to make this connection, but there's a real sort of like coming home motif throughout the book, and that feels like a sort of coming home moment for Pete, where it's like he recognizes probably something in Carbo, maybe that he's not admitting in himself. And obviously that's the whole point of baseball, right? You start at home, you journey around the bases, and you attempt to come back home. And yet, I think people would dispute calling Pete the prodigal son, because he doesn't quite have that redemption at the end. Or does he? I mean, is he a prodigal son, or is there redemption for Pete?
You know, when Rose died last fall, it was sort of a shock to people who knew him, which is sort of a crazy thing to say about an 83-year-old man who did have some health problems. You know, it just sort of felt like Pete would live forever, like he would outlive us all, you know? And when he died, you know, the news broke on a Monday night, and you know, my phone started blowing up, and then I started calling some people, you know, who I knew, who, you know, loved Pete, you know, his closest friends, and just called to basically commiserate. And the first person I called was Marty Brenneman, the longtime radio voice of the Cincinnati Reds. He's basically like the Jerry Remy of Cincinnati. You know, he's, you know, 40 plus years in the booth, same age as Pete Rose. They were there at the same time from the 70s all the way up. And Marty picked right up. And I could hear the news was on in the background. And like he was watching the news. And we commiserated for a second. One of the first things Marty said to me was, you know what's so sad about it is that he never got right. Yeah. He never got right, you know, with the world. And that was one thing that I tried to do with him. And, you know, when it's really how I got access to him, you know, is that I told people, including Marty, who helped make the introduction to Pete, was that, you know, we're all day to day, to use the sports, you know, cliche. We are all day to day. No one knows what tomorrow holds. But when you're 81 years old or 80 years old when I got to Pete, you know, you're especially day to day. And there was one last chance to reckon with this story. And that's really how I got to Pete. And you know, when his agent and Pete shut me out, you know, I made multiple efforts to get back in, basically saying, what are we doing here? Like, why are we running from this story at this point? You know, like, this is going to be neither good nor bad. This is going to be everything. This is going to be it. This is going to be the last great thing ever written about you. It's going to be the last great thing ever written about your clients. None of it worked. And I do think, you know, that Pete simply struggled to be weak. And I think that was fundamental to me understanding him. You know, I think Pete succeeds as a player and fails as a man for the exact same reasons. Mm-hmm. You know, he succeeds as a player because he will not bend, he will not break, he will believe until the very last moment that he will win. In every situation, Pete Rose believes he will beat you. But those same traits, his inability to bend, his inability to break, his refusal to be seen as weak, and this enduring belief that he will prevail are exactly why he can never really fully reckon with what he did to himself and to others.
The English teacher in me reading this the whole time, I just kept thinking like two names from literary history, Willy Loman, and honestly, The Great Gatsby, right? Jay Gatsby, this sort of like reinvention of self. And even some of the narrative technique in the book reminds me a little bit of Gatsby, where I see like, I mean, clearly you're not taking liberties with quotes, right? And this is this is objectively what people were saying, and yet at the same time, I feel like you're able to get inside of his head and imagine how he might have felt during certain moments. I'm thinking of the TWA airline that crashes across from his childhood home, and there's a line where Pete's looking over at the wreckage, and you imagine that being almost a turning point for him, how close a call that could have been. He could have been on that plane. And there are so many times like that throughout the book. Do you have, were there sort of literary models in your head as you were working on this?
You know, I love Willie Loman, the character.
Sure.
I just think it's just such a haunting and compelling character. And I think it was, so Willie Loman was in my mind as I was writing this book. And I think it was the New York Times, when the New York Times review came out, you know, they said he's, one of the last lines in the review is said that, you know, Keith portrays him as, you know, Willie Loman in spikes, you know, chugging toward his inevitable fall. And I do think there's some truth in that. But like, I mean, I wish I could sit up here and say I'm so literary as to think in that way as I'm living in my office with my piles of files around me. Like, I feel like so often I'm just trying to survive the manuscript, you know, just trying to get through it, trying to get through the chapter, trying to meet the deadline, all of that stress. It's a lot to endure without even thinking about, you know, literary references.
Yes. And oh, by the way. All right, so I measure time in innings, not in time, but I see that Katie's made her way into my periphery, so I was told I would leave time for some questions at the end. Are we going to do that? Yeah. Awesome. So if you have any questions for Keith, baseball questions or otherwise, I'm sure he'd be willing to entertain. And we have a microphone that will go around.
So I think that the title of the book calls out, you want to talk about who he was and how he became great and his baseball side. Do you think he will always remain a cautionary tale? Or do you think baseball still has an opportunity to separate the player that was great from the personal behaviors that kind of took him down?
So I think both are true. I do think that he will always be a cautionary tale. I don't think there's any way around that. But I do think that our opinions will continue to evolve on Pete Rose in the years to come and even right now. You know, for those who've been paying attention, President Trump this spring has talked about, pardoning Rose for his federal conviction for tax evasion. That, of course, has nothing to do with baseball or his admittance into the Hall of Fame. However, in recent months since Rose's death, his oldest child, Fawn Rose, his daughter, has met with Rob Manfred at Major League Baseball to petition again for her father's reinstatement to baseball. Pete himself met with Manfred on a couple of occasions to make the same case. I can tell you, having interviewed Fawn, she is different than her dad. She is very well educated, self-made, incredibly intelligent, well-spoken. I can assure you that the meeting that Rob Manfred had with Fawn Rose would have been decidedly different than the one he had with Pete. And I do think that as the gambling scandals continue, because they're going to continue, every single time they happen, Pete Rose's name will be back in the stories, in the headlines, in the discussions. And based on, the things we discussed earlier about addiction and predilection to addiction among young men, I do think it's inevitable that one of these times, the player who gets caught gambling is not going to be a minor star. The player is going to be a future Hall of Famer. It's inevitable. Because that person is not going to be betting on the games because they need the money. That's not what that's ever about. Pete Rose didn't need the money either. He was betting on it because he couldn't stop. And it was sort of fun, and then it was addicted, right? And I think one of these years, it's going to happen to a star, and when it does, I think baseball is going to have a real reckoning, because with all of us in this room able to have legal gambling apps on our phone right now, and many of us already using those apps, and people betting $135 billion legally on sports last year, $135 billion. I think America's going to shrug when the next star gets caught for gambling, and I do think that will swing the doors wide open for Pete Rose.
Another question?
So you said that how the World Series just last year had many fewer viewers than back in the past. What happened to baseball to make it change like that?
Great question. Like any sea change, it's never one thing. By the late 1960s, early 1970s, football was on the rise. The Joe Namath Super Bowl upset fundamentally changes things for football, and it immediately in the following year becomes equally as popular as baseball, and then goes right past it. I think that was about television. I think that was about viewing tendencies. As we all know, baseball is a bit more of a vibe than football. I love to go to a baseball game in the summer or coach a baseball game in the summer, but sitting in my living room and watching 3 hours of a summer baseball game feels less likely. I'm going to watch 3 hours in the fall when it really matters. So I think all of that was happening as a change. I think fundamentally it was television and football that changed the course for baseball.
Any more questions? I agree. Who could follow after that? Very smart young man asked that great question. Okay, I think we're all set. Thank you all so much. Keith is going to sign books in the back room. Thank you for coming.
I want to thank Dan. Thank you, Dan. That was awesome.